Joining us now is Dr. Frederick Engram. He is a professor at UTA, and I'm not going to steal your thunder. I love to have people share a little bit more about themselves. So I'm going to turn it right over to you, Dr. Engram, and tell us who you are, what you do, and it's a pleasure to have you join us today.
No problem at all. Certainly. Thanks for having me. I am an assistant professor of instruction in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice, as well as the Center for African American Studies. I'm a scholar as well whose research focuses on the intersections between racism, higher education, and the criminal justice systems. I look at the way that white privilege, white manning, racism affect the African American lived experience more specifically.
So I'm going to pause here and say, if you've got questions at any time for Dr. Engram or throughout the rest of the show, go ahead and drop them in the chat. Comments as well. We'd love to hear from you. I'm not only watching on our Texas Metro News page, but on mine as well. So Dr. Engram, you are doing what you do at a very unique time in history. And so one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is we talked a little bit in our first segment with the mother and daughter about how they approach race in their conversations and in their family. But I want to get a historical perspective from you as an expert about race.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what's the foundation for race?
So race is an interesting concept because many people don't know that race itself is socially constructed. And so to understand the way that it was socially constructed, we have to go all the way back. There has always been levels of hierarchy in different systems, or caste systems in India and that sort of thing, that allowed people with lighter hue skin tones to be considered elite or privileged, and if you will, and those who were darker in complexion to often be looked at as less than or subjugated, essentially. America is an interesting place because if you look at it, it's a very interesting concept that we had enslaved Africans in America for some time, but race didn't immediately join us once we touched these lands. As Dr. Jacqueline Badalora talks about in her work, A Birth of a White Nation, whiteness itself did not come to be until 1681. And what I mean by whiteness, I mean like the actual legal establishment of white as a race. That served a couple of perspectives. Anti-miscegenation statutes existed for about 300 years or so prior to 1681, but the United States, or at the time those colonies, actually made anti-miscegenation law. The purpose of that was to keep people from mixing races and making it illegal to do so. What was interesting about that, as we all know, during enslavement, that served two purposes. And the first one was to keep white women from procreating, marrying, or engaging in sex, interracial sex, with the enslaved African men. But it also gave way for white enslavers to then rape Black women or the enslaved African women. And there were no legal bounds in most cases that prevented that from occurring. Sometimes you would see where white men who created a child, a mixed race child with an enslaved woman, would be punished, but very rarely. However, it was a crime for white women to do this. And so when you think about that, you insert patriarchy in there, because most of the people who were creating legislation that made those conditions illegal were the slave owners and the elite. But what people often leave out of the conversation is that white women were also part of the elite, and that white women also were enslavers. What people don't realize and they don't talk about enough, and Dr. Stephanie Jones-Rodgers discusses this in her work, They Were Her Property. White women were also enslavers, and there were lots of white women who actually owned their own enslaved Africans. Many of them were passed down from family, from father to daughter, when she married, as a gift. In other instances, women who were married and their husbands died and they became widows, they would also receive their enslaved Africans that way as well. So in being able to make legislation, you had to be a property owner, you had to have property, and property meaning enslaved Africans, but white women were largely not allowed to be in that. So not only do we have white men making rules and laws regarding race and the construct of race, they're also making rules that were patriarchal in establishment.
And so fast forward with us, how did that foundation, that legislation, those rules that were made so long ago, from your perspective, how did that set us up for where we are today? And I know that's a broad question.
It is, but also, yeah. So it set us up where we are now because anti-miscegenation allowed for different laws to be created, specifically regarding race and its construct. So we all know today, like police have certain discretions and they have jurisdictions that allows them to do pick and choose who they want to arrest, what they want to arrest them for, and how they want to let others go. Anti-miscegenation allowed for the same thing, where we can create laws like Jim Crow that specifically targeted Black people. We could create laws under segregation that specifically targeted Black people, although we had laws of civil rights that prevented segregation by race solely also on the books. They then turned over the legislation over to the states, who would then employ and enact Jim Crow legislation. So it was always this dichotomy when it came to the law of the land, and then who would actually be beneficiaries of that legislation and who would be subjugated by that legislation. So that's what the construct of race actually did.
So what do we do? What do we do about that as everyday people? You know, you've helped us approach this from an academic perspective. Obviously, we're here saying that the problem is rooted deeply into our history, deeply into our foundations. So as everyday people, as people of color, as Black folks, how do we start to have productive conversations, particularly with people that do not look like us in 2021?
Mm-hmm. One of the worst things we could do is pretend like it didn't happen. I think a lot of well-intentioned white folks like to lean into this concept of colorblind. I don't see color. You know, I love everyone. All humans are the same to me. And that's actually more harmful than you think, because what you're saying is that you don't see me, you don't see my humanity, you don't see my lived experience, and you don't see the oppression that me and my people have endured in this country for hundreds and hundreds of years. So like that is actually the worst. What we can do is understand the harm that the creation of race created, the harm that continued to follow the subjugation of enslaved Africans, and make space for the understanding of that. Do the reading, right? Don't lean into your privilege. Don't lean into what makes you comfortable. And part of doing anti-racist work is not centering the voices of the privileged or the voices of the majority. It is focusing on the way that these experiences have impacted the marginalized. And I think as long as we focus on the least of us, the most of us will always benefit from that. And white people who are doing the work aren't going to push back against that. White people who are doing the work are not going to be upset by understanding, because they're doing the reading, so they fully understand where the intersections of power and privilege and our existence both come into play. So we shouldn't be concerned about like, well, we don't want to say a certain thing because we don't want to upset, you know, a certain group of people, that certain group of people being white people. And if that's how we're approaching anti-racist work, then that's incorrect, because we shouldn't be centering the voices of the oppressors.
And so tell us, you've mentioned reading and educating yourself. So where can we start with finding good, accurate information?
So there's a lot of places I definitely recommend watching. You know, a lot of people don't want to sit and read a lot of super academically rigorous stuff. So there's videos. You can look up Dr. Jacqueline Badalora on YouTube. She has videos that explains what I just talked about in Birth of the White Nation, and antimiscegenation, the creation of whiteness, which also created the construct of race. That's always a good place to start. I think understanding the role of critically critiquing race and its existence. Critical race theory is always good. We heard a lot of disdain toward that in our last administration, but it's reality. That there's a lot of that work. You can look up Derek Bell. You can look up Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, Richard Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw. We want to talk about the intersectionality of Black womanliness. That's a great place to start as well. So there's a lot of work out there that talks about these experiences.
When you just mentioned that term critical race theory, and it's a point of confusion for a lot of people. A lot of folks know that that was the term to stay away from, but people don't know why. So can you give us a broad definition about what it is and why it garnered so much attention and criticism?
Certainly. So anything that is done that is looking at a surveying of the experience of race and racism. It started as a legal terminology or legal theoretical framework by Derek Bell and Alan Freeman to look at the experiences of Black people in law, right, and specifically in law school and that sort of thing. And then it transcended and it grew, and Drs. Gloria Ladson-Billings and others put it into an educational frame so we can understand it more in ways that we can apply it. Critical race theory is nothing to be afraid of, because what it does is it allows us to look at the study of race and racism from an educational perspective. It allows us to be able to see where the roles of racism and race intersect. For example, interest convergence is a tenet of critical race theory. And what that talks about is how we are granted particular things only if and then there's a benefit to whiteness. And what I mean by that is, like, there are experiences that we haven't, like, for example, you look at segregation, right? And we could look at segregation where, well, the Black people have their schools on one side of town and white people have their schools on one side of town. So we essentially did something about their experiences, but we are not having to give up anything as white people, right? So interest convergence is about allowing Blackness to have something as long as there's a benefit to whiteness. We could also look at whiteness as property, that talks about the value of whiteness as a property. And we can see how that was displayed in the movements of the summer. People were not, most white people who have not done this work were really upset about how we were responding to the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others, right? They were upset about that, but they were upset about the way that we showed our eloquent rage and our upset. They didn't like the fact that buildings were being burned, and they were more upset about property value than they were about the human condition. And that explains whiteness as property. It talks about how white people take up space and they make things their own, like you've seen multiple incidents over the summer, or just in general, where children are selling lemonade and a white woman comes up to them and asks for a permit, or people are swimming at their apartment complex, their swimming pool, and a white person says, "Show me that you live here," or "Prove that you live here," or the situation of in Central Park with the bird watching. So that's whiteness as property. White people literally will take stock in space and claim literally anywhere. It could be a public sidewalk. They have now claimed it, and now you're trespassing. So that's critical race theory. So not wanting people to talk about it is not wanting people to understand just how deeply embedded in our society racism is.
Do you think, one of the questions I posed to you that I want to discuss, do you think there's room for mutual understanding for Black and white communities? Do you think
Most
that okay, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Most certainly I do. I think that, I think that there is definitely room for understanding, but a lot of people look at it wrong, right? People look at it like they want us to continue to give more, right? They want us to continue to provide more space and more understanding and more grace for them to meet us here. But it's been 400 plus years. How much more grace and space and understanding do we need to provide for people who have yet to even make marginal steps, right? So that should not be our focus. And we should even focus on the ones who are not willing to move. Our work is in those who are deciding to come along as co-conspirators. And if you notice, I said co-conspirators and not allies, because allying allows you to pick and choose when you want to step into the front lines, when you want to roll up your sleeves and do the work with us. Being a co-conspirator means that I'm willing to be there in the trenches right along with you. And I got that from Dr. Bettina Love, where she talks about that a lot in our abolitionist work, where people who are looking to come along on the journey are not looking for an easy way in or looking for ways to be able to be a part of it, but like not having to roll their sleeves up, get their hands dirty, or in some instances face arrest. When you're using your white body or you're using your white privilege to in fact cover those of us who are out here in the trenches, that is a co-conspirator, and that is where our work is, not on the end of those who are clearly relentless and not wanting to move.
One thing that I wanted to ask you about as an educator, you did write an article way back when, the impact of whiteness on higher education hiring. Can you talk to us more about that?
Certainly, yes. Yeah. So that talks about the way that whiteness is infused in higher education. For example, I earned my doctorate, a few years ago, and a lot of the time when I was on the market, looking for employment, a lot of the white men who were the people who would be interviewing me had credentials that were lesser than mine. They hadn't earned a doctorate. They hadn't been in the practice of higher education for as long as I have, but they are the ones who are deciding whether or not I am good enough to be able to take on the listed role, and how they would apply certain things. I remember emailing one hiring manager, and in my email signature clearly lists my credentials, and the gentleman specifically made it a point to call me Mr. Engram in his reply. I had another incident where someone contacted me regarding an open position because they had heard about me, and they're like, I really would love to have you be a part of the team, but the position was entry level uh, at the institution, literally entry level, which is a bachelor's degree and minimal experience. And this gentleman had never worked in higher education ever. This was literally his first role, and he is in the position of, I believe, vice president or assistant vice president. And he was asking me to come in and work under him in a very tier one level position, an entry level position, fully understanding my experience, my work, and my credentials. And lastly, there was an incident where I was recruited for an institution, and the person who was doing the recruiting was saying very anti-Black things. He used the word token in our conversation regarding someone at the university, and tried to tell me things like HBCUs are not diverse. And so there's a lot of ways that not doing the reading as a white person and engaging with people who actually do true DEI work was where the whiteness was showing up. And that's what I mean by people who haven't done the reading.
And you got quite a response to that. What did that say to you? All across social media it looked like. So what did that communicate to you?
It did that. People understood. I got a lot of feedback from even white males who were like, this article allowed me to reconsider how I show up in particular spaces. It allowed me to reconsider how I show up on hiring committees. I had other people who were like, this is my story. Thanks for speaking it. Truth to power. Thanks for acknowledging some of the things that I myself have experienced, but I, for whatever reason or another, was afraid to, or am afraid to, speak out because of retaliation. And one of the recruiters was terminated from that post after that experience because the university read the article.
Wow. And so another thing that you've mentioned in the context of this conversation is anti-Blackness. And I was watching a TikTok video actually this weekend about somebody explaining it. And I think this is a good time because there are lots of creative ways to explain hard topics. But can you give us a breakdown of what anti-Blackness means? I don't want to presume that folks know.
Fair. Anti-Blackness is one of the many byproducts of white supremacy, and anti-Blackness can be displayed from anyone. You don't have to be white to be anti-Black. Anti-Blackness is literally being anything anti-Black. Comments like, her name is ghetto, right? Or how do you pronounce the name? Or referring to literally anything as ghetto, because what you really mean is that it's Black. And that's where, that comes up. People using complexion colorism to define someone as a personality trait, hair texture. I mean, there's so many variables that fall into anti-Blackness. And I often tell people, I was like, you participate in anti-Blackness and you don't realize that's what you're doing because you're so used to the conditioning of those thoughts that you're not aware that you actually lean into white supremacy and are an actor of that by doing those. Like, I don't want to go to a certain part of town because it's too Black. Or my favorite, I don't want to go to an HBCU because it's not a real world experience, or it doesn't prepare you for the real world, or you're not going to have the same accessibility or the same opportunities that you would if you attended a predominantly white institution. Is my favorite loud anti-Black language.
And speaking of HBCUs, you attended an HBCU.
I did.
So tell us about that experience and how that set the foundation for the work you're doing today.
Sure. I attended Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina, a small liberal arts institution. It was interesting because I remember I grew up in New York. I was born in California, but I was raised in New York primarily, and I came from a very different educational experience in K-12. We skied in gym class in middle school, right? Like that was something that I thought was normal, but I later would learn that it wasn't. We had 26 different spoken languages within my high school. So diversity was something that we lived. We didn't have to talk about it in that regard because it was something that we actually lived. I went to school with ethnic groups that people hadn't even heard of, and I thought it was very normal to me. It was very much so a diverse melting pot of cultures and traditions and people. And we almost never, at least not to my knowledge, ever had experiences of racism because it was normal to us. We didn't, recognize that it was different. And so attending an HBCU was something I wanted to do because I had never had a Black male educator. I had never seen Black administrators. We had Black women, educators because Black women rock and Black women pursue, higher education and graduate degrees. So they're always going to be front and center. But I had never had a Black male teacher, administrator, and that sort of thing. And I wanted the Black college experience. I was, one of the kids who was fortunate enough to grow up, at least in my formative years, to see a different world and to see Cosby Show and those shows that were very transformative, to millennials and be able to see that and really want to experience what that looked like. And Johnson C. Smith was amazing for me. It helped me in so many ways, understanding why my Blackness is not only beautiful, but it's unique. And Blackness is in fact not a monolithic experience, and that one version of Blackness is not an overarching version that applies to everyone. It provided me an understanding that I could do anything and be anything that I wanted to be, as we saw, as we see now in Madam VP Kamala Harris, right? We see that you can attend an HBCU, you can amount to great heights in both your educational pursuits, your professional pursuits, and be literally anywhere. If I listened to the naysayers that said HBCUs are party schools only, I wouldn't be a professor at a Research One institution in a whole nother state. So that tells you a lot about what people don't know. And also those comments, as I mentioned, were anti-Black. And I feel like had that experience, I feel prepared. I don't suffer from imposter syndrome. It's a conversation I have with a lot of people. I never feel that I'm not where I should be. I know I worked hard to be here and I deserved, this space because I worked for this space and I received all of that foundational underpinning from my historically Black college experience.
So now as an educator, and I know we just have a few minutes left, but now as an educator, what issues or barriers do you see students facing now that perhaps even maybe didn't exist before?
There's a definitely, we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? So like there's definitely a barrier where we're now recognizing just the disparities that students deal with. I think, prior to the pandemic, we didn't realize how many people were impoverished, how many people were affected by impoverished living circumstances. We assume that everyone is on the same playing field, and we all know that is fundamentally false. But what this experience taught us was that there are people that don't have the bare minimum. People don't have the internet. People don't have laptops. And the gross assumption that a lot of people make is that everybody has access and everybody has equitable living circumstances. And that is part of not understanding just how deeply embedded in racism and white supremacy our country is, to assume that even the most marginalized of us have the same things in their home that the most privileged of us do. And so this time highlighted that for us to show us that this actually false, and that's why there's so many parents who are fighting to get their kids in school, with not full understanding of what we're talking about here, but also understanding like my kids need to have educators teaching them, impacting them and showing them, because without that, the trajectory for my children push them right on track for the school to prison pipeline if they're not in those spaces. So there's a lot that we're discovering, that we're seeing, and we don't even know how bad it's actually going to be until we get out of this.
And another question I have for you as for folks, students and parents who exist in mostly white spaces, how can they effectively begin conversations about race that have impact?
Mhm. First, you can't allow your voice to be derailed. I think a lot of people who are the minority or the solo dolo person in those spaces are often afraid of speaking up because they're afraid they're going to be railroaded. And I always say this, like, you have to fight for something. As Audre Lorde told us, your silence will not save you, right? You have to be open to and willing to use your